It was one of those mornings that felt too quiet, the kind where you notice every sound: the spoon tapping, the coffee mug, the hum of the fridge, the clock that somehow gets louder when no one's talking. Thomas sat across from me, still in his work shirt, scrolling through something on his phone like I wasn't even there. 15 years of marriage, and I could already tell this wasn't going to be a normal day. He didn't look angry. That's the part that threw me off. He just looked empty, like a man waiting for a bus that already passed. I was staring at the steam rising from my coffee when he said it as calm as if he were commenting on the weather. "I regret marrying you." Just like that. No warning, no argument leading up to it. Just a statement. I thought I misheard him, but he didn't flinch, didn't even look up from his mug. I sat there, frozen, the air thick enough to choke on. My first instinct was to ask why, but something in his tone told me I wouldn't get an answer that mattered. So I didn't ask. I didn't say a word. I just stared at the window, at the sunlight touching the counter, and thought about how a single sentence could rewrite 15 years of shared life. He took another sip, stood up, rinsed his mug, and said, "I'll be home late, big day at work." Then he walked out the door like he hadn't just detonated our marriage in the middle of breakfast. I sat there for a long time after that. The coffee went cold, but I couldn't move. My hands felt too heavy, my throat too tight. I didn't cry. Not because I wasn't hurt, but because crying would have meant there was still something left to fight for. You'd think that kind of moment would come with shouting or drama, maybe a thrown plate or two. But no. Real heartbreak doesn't always scream. Sometimes it just sighs, quietly, across a kitchen table. As I looked around the room, I saw the little signs that had been there all along. His briefcase left on the counter, because he couldn't be bothered to put it away. The untouched breakfast I made every morning, even though he rarely ate anymore. The way he hadn't said good morning in weeks. I started realizing he'd been leaving me for a long time, just in smaller pieces. It wasn't like we'd been fighting. That's the cruel part. There were no big explosions, just slow erosion. We'd turned into polite roommates who happened to share bills and a bed. Maybe that's worse than fighting. At least fighting means someone still cares enough to argue. And sitting there that morning, I finally understood. He didn't hate me. He just didn't feel anything at all. And that was so much worse. I went upstairs after he left, walked into our bedroom, and everything looked painfully normal. The bed was made. His jacket was still hanging on the chair, my robe on the hook. Nothing out of place except the life that used to exist between us. I touched the edge of the dresser, the one he'd built when we first moved in, and felt that weird mix of nostalgia and nausea. 15 years. You don't realize how much of yourself you pour into someone until they tell you they don't want it anymore. Every meal cooked, every plan made, every compromise suddenly meaningless. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the framed photo of our wedding day on the nightstand. We looked so happy. I remember how my mom used to say, "Marriage isn't about being happy all the time, it's about staying." And I did stay. Through long hours, missed anniversaries, broken promises, and the quiet distance that settled between us, I stayed until he decided not to. That's the thing no one tells you about regret sometimes. It's not loud or dramatic. It's a calm confession said over coffee while the other person forgets to breathe. That morning, something inside me shifted. Not shattered, just stopped. Like a clock that quietly gives up ticking. Maybe that's what he wanted. Maybe he was tired of pretending we still had something to fix. Or maybe he just didn't think I'd actually hear him. But I did. Loud and clear. And once you've heard something like that, you can't unhear it. I didn't know it yet, but that sentence would change everything: the way I saw him, the way I saw myself, even the way I understood love. I sat there for a long time, watching the light move across the wall, feeling the weight of 15 years settle on my shoulders. Then I finally stood up, washed the dishes, and got ready for work. Because what else do you do when your life falls apart before 8 a.m.? You pretend it didn't. You keep moving. You smile when your coworker asks if you're okay. You say you're just tired. And you start learning what silence really sounds like when there's nothing left to fill it. If you've ever had someone look you in the eye and tell you they regret loving you, tell me in the comments, how did you handle it? I read every story, and I promise you're not the only one who's been there. And if this story resonates with you, don't forget to subscribe. There's more ahead that you won't want to miss. That morning didn't end with an argument or a slammed door. It just ended with me realizing that sometimes the quietest words can change everything. The next few days felt like walking through fog. Everything looked the same, but nothing felt real. The house still smelled like coffee in the morning, his shoes still sat by the door, and his voice still echoed faintly when he took business calls, yet it all felt like watching a life I wasn't part of anymore. Thomas left for work early that week, every day. I stopped asking when he'd be home. He'd mumble something about a project deadline, kiss me on the cheek without actually looking, and vanish before I could even finish my sentence. I started eating dinner alone, something that used to feel wrong, but had now become a quiet relief. I could tell he was slipping away, not in some big dramatic way, but in small, invisible steps. No fights, no shouting, just a kind of absence that filled every room. One night, I noticed how long it had been since he'd laughed. Not at me, not even with me, just in general. He'd come home, loosen his tie, grab his laptop, and disappear into his office. I'd bring him tea sometimes, hoping for a thank you or a smile. Most nights, I just got a distracted thanks without eye contact. It was like living with a ghost who still paid bills. He used to text me during the day stupid things like, "Don't forget to eat," or "What's for dinner?" Those had stopped. I scrolled through our old messages once, and it was almost funny. I could trace the moment his interest died. The texts got shorter, colder, until there was just silence. One evening, I was lying in bed when his phone lit up on the nightstand. A message preview appeared. "I miss our talks." I froze. It wasn't my name on the screen. It was Elaine. I'd met her once, years ago, at a company party. Divorced, friendly, a little too charming for someone who smiled that much around other women's husbands. I remembered how Thomas used to talk about her. "She's sharp. Great head for numbers." He'd said it like it was a compliment that somehow didn't involve me. I turned over, pretending to sleep, my pulse hammering in my ears. The next few minutes stretched forever. I heard him quietly pick up his phone, saw the faint glow against his face as he read whatever she'd sent. Then came the soft click of the phone locking again, followed by a long sigh. That sound, that small exhale, hurt more than the words ever could. I wanted to ask. I wanted to say, "Who is she to you now?" But I didn't. I just lay there, still as stone, letting the silence swallow everything. By morning, I told myself I might have imagined it. Maybe it wasn't what it looked like. That's what women do when we're desperate to believe the life we built still means something. We create excuses for the people tearing it down. He left early again that day, muttering something about a client meeting. His cologne lingered after he was gone, that clean, crisp scent I used to love. I stood there, holding the coffee pot, staring at the empty kitchen like it had answers. Around noon, I caught myself looking at the clock and wondering if he'd eaten lunch. Old habits die hard. Then I laughed out loud, a short, bitter laugh that startled even me. Why did I care? That night, he called to say he'd be late again. I said okay, before realizing he'd already hung up. When he finally got home, it was almost midnight. He looked exhausted, or maybe just uninterested. His tie was gone, his shirt wrinkled. I asked if everything was fine at work. He nodded, kissed the top of my head, and went straight upstairs. "No, good night." The next morning, I tried something different. I made his favorite breakfast blueberry pancakes, the kind I hadn't cooked in years. He came down, grabbed his coffee, and said, "Oh, you didn't have to." Then he took a sip and checked his phone. Not even one bite. That was the moment I realized the truth. The worst kind of betrayal isn't a new woman, it's indifference. I'd rather he yelled at me, or confessed, or even lied badly, anything but this quiet erasure. It's strange how you can live with someone every day and still feel like a stranger breaking into your own house. Later that evening, I found myself cleaning the counter just to have something to do. The silence was unbearable. Every sound, the faucet dripping, the hum of the fridge, felt louder than it should. I kept glancing at the clock, counting the minutes until he'd come home, and then hating myself for doing it. When I finally heard the garage door open, I felt nothing. No relief, No warmth, just a dull ache in my chest. He came in talking on his phone, laughing at something. It wasn't the laugh he used with me. He noticed me standing there, gave a small wave, and went upstairs still talking. The sound of his voice faded, leaving that same suffocating quiet behind. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept staring at the ceiling, trying to figure out how something that once felt so solid had turned hollow without me noticing. I remembered the first time we'd met how he'd smiled like I was the only person in the room. I wondered when he stopped looking at me that way. When I finally closed my eyes, the last thing I saw was that text glowing in the dark. I miss our talks. It wasn't proof yet, but it was enough. And somewhere deep down, under all the denial and exhaustion, I knew this was the beginning of the end, and I wasn't ready to admit it yet. I remember my hands shaking before I even knew why. It was a Tuesday morning, nothing unusual. Thomas had left early, as always. His laptop was still open on the kitchen counter, a half-finished spreadsheet glowing on the screen. I only needed to check an invoice for a client. Just 5 minutes, that's all I thought I was doing. The email tab was open. I didn't mean to click it. My finger just slipped. There they were, subject lines stacked one after another, like a slow-motion confession. Lunch next week? I can't stop thinking about what you said. And the newest one, bold and unread. Last night meant a lot. My stomach turned before I even opened it. But I did. Thomas, it began. I don't know how to explain how much you've helped me feel seen again. You always listen. You understand things that other people miss. I wish Clara could do that for you. Signed, Elaine. That line, I wish Clara could do that for you, hit harder than any affair ever could. I wasn't angry, not yet. Just hollow. I scrolled through the thread, reading his replies. They weren't sexual. They weren't explicit. They were worse. You deserve to feel understood. I don't know when it stopped being easy at home. You're the only person I can really talk to. I could almost hear his voice saying it calm, soft, the way he used to sound with me before everything went quiet. It's funny how emotional cheating always comes wrapped in politeness. No swearing, no lies that sound like lies. Just gentle sentences that slice you open slowly. I read until my eyes blurred. The timestamps told me what I already feared. Late nights, weekends, the same hours he'd told me he was working late. At some point, I realized I was holding my breath. I closed the laptop, stood still, and waited for my hands to stop shaking. They didn't. I made myself a cup of tea. I never drank. I sat at the table where he'd said he regretted marrying me, and I thought about how quiet betrayal really is. It doesn't come with slammed doors or lipstick stains. Sometimes it comes with email notifications and perfect grammar. When Thomas got home that evening, I watched him walk through the door like a stranger. He smiled faintly, said, "Hey," and kissed the air near my cheek. I almost laughed. The gesture was so practiced, so empty, it felt like muscle memory. He went upstairs to change. I stared at the back of his head as he climbed the steps and thought, that's the man who just wrote another woman that I don't understand him. I could have confronted him right then. I could have screamed, thrown the laptop, packed his things. But I didn't. I wanted to see what silence could do. That night, I cooked dinner, something simple, roast chicken and vegetables, the kind of meal you make when you're trying to feel normal. He didn't even notice the effort. We ate quietly. He talked about work. I nodded like an actress playing a wife in a movie she didn't audition for. Halfway through dinner, he said, "Elaine's coming back to the firm as a consultant. Management wants me to help her get settled." I looked up from my plate. That should be interesting. He didn't catch the edge in my voice. Yeah, she's great at what she does. I wanted to ask, is that all she's great at? But I didn't. I just smiled, the kind of polite smile you wear when your dignity's hanging by a thread. That night, when he went to bed, I stayed downstairs. I opened my journal for the first time in years and wrote, "He's not cheating with his body, he's cheating with his heart. Maybe that hurts more." It wasn't much, but it was the truth. Over the next few days, I noticed things I hadn't before. How he'd angle his phone away when it buzzed. How he'd linger outside when he took calls. How he laughed, that quiet, private laugh I hadn't heard in months. but only when he was looking at his screen. I stopped asking questions. I just started watching. And the more I watched, the less I recognized the man I'd married. One night, as he showered, I checked his phone again. It wasn't locked. I don't know if he trusted me or just didn't care anymore. The latest message was short. Elaine, you deserve better. Thomas, maybe someday I'll have it. I stared at that sentence for a long time. Maybe someday I'll have it. That was when something in me went still, like a switch flipping off. I didn't feel love. He didn't even feel pain. Just done. When he came out of the shower, he smiled at me. Everything okay? I said, yeah, perfect. He didn't notice that I meant it differently than he did. The next morning, I woke up early. I made coffee, sat at the same table, and looked out the window. Outside, life went on. The mail truck passed, kids walked to school, a neighbor waved. Ordinary things, steady and indifferent. And sitting there, I realized something. Betrayal doesn't destroy you all at once. It peels you, one truth at a time, until there's nothing left but the version of yourself that finally stops caring. By the time Thomas came downstairs, I was calm. Too calm. He poured his coffee, asked, "You okay?" I nodded. Never better. He smiled and kissed my cheek again the same way he always did, and I thought, if he only knew what I know now, maybe he'd regret more than just marrying me. By Friday, I'd convinced myself to play normal again. It was easier than letting him see that I knew. He came home late every night that week, and I stopped asking why. I smiled when he smiled, nodded when he talked about work, and cooked just enough for two, though only one plate ever really got eaten. That weekend, one of his coworkers threw a dinner party. "Just come with me," he said. "It'll look weird if I go alone." That line, "it'll look weird," was his version of affection now. Not, "I want you there," just, "You make me look better when you're next to me." So, I went. I wore a navy dress he'd once said made my eyes look lighter. He didn't notice. On the drive there, he scrolled through his phone the whole time, smirking once at something he read. I didn't need to ask who it was. The dinner was held at a coworker's house, one of those suburban places with a giant open kitchen and too many wine glasses. Everyone looked too polished, too cheerful. They greeted me with hugs and smiles. The kind people give out of politeness, not affection. Thomas slipped easily into conversation, talking about stock prices, projects, and golf plans. I played my role, the quiet, supportive wife who laughs when she's supposed to. For most of the evening, I managed. Until his coworker's wife, a woman named Kelly, asked, "So, Clara, what do you do with all your free time now that your kids are older?" I smiled politely. "I still take on design clients. Keeps me busy." Before I could finish, Thomas laughed. "She's basically a professional worrier. If there's nothing to fix, she'll invent something." Everyone laughed, even Kelly, even me for about half a second, because what else was I supposed to do? But inside, something cracked. It was small, but I felt it. He wasn't done. Seriously, she once rearranged the whole living room because she thought the couch was emotionally blocking the window. More laughter. I took a sip of wine, let the sound blur into background noise. My face felt hot, my heart pounding steady but cold. I didn't look at him. I couldn't. The conversation moved on: travel, kids, work gossip. I nodded when someone asked if we'd gone anywhere recently. Thomas said, "Not really. Clara's not much of a traveler. She likes staying in her comfort zone." He didn't even realize he was describing his own prison. Later, when dessert came out, Kelly's husband raised a toast. "To good marriages and better friends," he said. Everyone laughed and clinked glasses. Thomas smirked and added, 15 years, that's a long time to tolerate anyone." More laughter. And that's when it hit me, they didn't see me as a wife. I was the joke. The punchline to his performance of a happy husband. I smiled anyway. Smiling had become second nature, like breathing through smoke. On the drive home, he didn't mention the party. He just turned on the radio and hummed softly to some old pop song. I stared out the window, watching the reflection of streetlights smear across the glass. When we got home, he dropped his keys on the counter and said, "You were quiet tonight." I didn't have much to say. He shrugged. You could try smiling more. You always seem so serious lately. I wanted to laugh, really laugh, but it came out as something else. You're right, I said. Maybe I should learn to take a joke. Ah, no. He didn't catch the sarcasm. He never did. While he watched TV, I stood in the kitchen, rinsing plates that didn't need rinsing. I could still hear his voice in my head, that laugh, that line. A long time to tolerate anyone. Tolerate. That's what our marriage had become, endurance, disguised as loyalty. I thought back to the day he'd proposed. He was so nervous, he almost dropped the ring. He told me I made his life brighter, steadier. And now, 15 years later, he was using that steadiness as a punchline. The next morning, I woke up early. He was still asleep, snoring softly like he hadn't turned me into a public joke hours earlier. I looked at him, really looked, and felt nothing. No love, no hate, not even pity. Just a quiet understanding that whatever we had left wasn't marriage anymore. In the kitchen, I made myself coffee and opened my notebook. Not my diary, just a blank notebook I used for grocery lists and reminders. I started writing without really knowing what I wanted to say. He doesn't have to yell to humiliate me. He just has to laugh. That line stayed on the page longer than I expected. I read it again, then closed the notebook. Around noon, he came downstairs and asked if I wanted to join him for brunch with some colleagues. I said no. He didn't ask why. He grabbed his jacket, muttered something about traffic, and left. The second the door closed, the house went dead quiet. Not the peaceful kind, the kind that hums in your ears, like an empty shell of what used to be alive. I stood there, surrounded by all the things I used to care about: the clean counters, the smell of his cologne, the framed photos that had long since lost their meaning. That's when I knew. It wasn't the emails or the lies that broke me. It was that dinner, that laughter that made me realize how small I'd become in my own life. He thought I wouldn't notice. He thought I'd keep smiling and pretending. But something in me had started to wake up. Something that wasn't going to keep tolerating being the joke in someone else's story. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel broken. I just felt done pretending. I didn't plan to talk to him that night. Honestly, I didn't plan to talk to him ever again if I could avoid it. But silence has a way of cornering you when you live under the same roof. Thomas came home late, as usual. I was sitting in the living room with the TV on low, not really watching, just letting the noise fill the air. He walked in, loosened his tie, and said, "You're still up?" Like it was some kind of inconvenience. "Yeah," I said. "Couldn't sleep." He nodded, half listening, already heading toward the kitchen. I watched him pour a drink, neat, no ice, the same drink he used to share with me when we were younger. Back then, we'd sit on the couch, talk about our day, laugh about something stupid. Now, the only thing we shared was the oxygen in the room. I didn't know what made me do it, but I said, "Thomas, are you happy?" He stopped mid-sip, then set the glass down. "What kind of question is that?" "An honest one." He sighed. "I don't know. Maybe not. Why?" "I just needed to hear it from you." He leaned against the counter. "Clara, we've been doing this for a long time. People change. Life changes. It's not like it used to be." "Because you stopped trying," I said quietly. He frowned, like he didn't understand English anymore. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means I've been holding up both sides of this marriage while you've been somewhere else emotionally or maybe even physically. I'm not sure which anymore." He looked irritated, not guilty. "You're reading too much into things again. Not everything's some grand betrayal." "All." "Then tell me," I said, my voice shaking just a little. "Who is Elaine to you?" That name hit like a dart. He froze for a second, the kind of second that answers every question you wish you'd never asked. "She's a friend," he said finally. "Friends don't send emails about missing your voice." He rolled his eyes. "Jesus, Clara, you went through my emails?" "I read enough to know that you don't talk to me that way anymore." He stared at me for a long moment. Then he laughed, not a funny laugh, but a short, mean one. "You're making a drama out of nothing. We were just talking. God, you always blow things out of proportion." I didn't say anything. I just looked at him, really looked, and realized I didn't recognize the man standing in front of me. He sighed again and said, "You know what, Clara? I regret marrying you." There it was again. The same sentence. This time, without the shock, just confirmation. I nodded slowly. Good to know. Envy sit. He expected me to argue, to cry, maybe even beg. I didn't. I picked up his empty glass, rinsed it, and set it in the dishwasher. My movements were steady, almost calm. He looked uncomfortable, like he didn't know what to do with a wife who wasn't collapsing in front of him. You're not going to say anything? I dried my hands. No. You've said enough for both of us. He muttered something under his breath, grabbed his jacket, and went upstairs. I stood in the kitchen, staring at the dark window, seeing nothing but my own reflection. That's when I understood. You don't lose a marriage in one moment. You lose it piece by piece through dismissive words, missing touches, unanswered texts, and dinners eaten in silence. By the time you finally admit it's gone, the love's already been dead for years. I walked upstairs later, opened the bedroom door, and saw him asleep on his side of the bed, turned away from me. His breathing was even, peaceful. I used to find that sound comforting. Now it just reminded me that he slept well while I fell apart beside him. I opened my nightstand drawer and pulled out my old journal. The one I hadn't written in since our daughter was in elementary school. The pages were yellowed, the cover frayed, but it still smelled faintly of ink and perfume. I flipped through the old entries notes about the kids, grocery lists, random thoughts until I found a blank page. I started writing. He said he regrets marrying me. I should feel shattered, but all I feel is relief. Maybe it's finally over. Maybe I can stop trying to love someone who's already gone. The words came easier than I expected. I didn't stop there. I wrote about the dinner, the laughter, the text messages, the years of feeling invisible. By the time I finished, 3 pages were filled. My handwriting looked shaky, but honest. When I closed the journal, I felt something shift. Not pain, not peace, just clarity. The next morning I woke up before him. The sun was barely up, the house still quiet. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the floor. My feet felt heavy, like even standing would take too much effort. Thomas stirred and looked at me. You okay? He asked, like it was a line he'd been trained to say. I'm fine, I said, my voice steady. Just thinking. Oh. He shrugged, rolled over, and went back to sleep. Downstairs, I made coffee. I didn't pour him a cup. For the first time in 15 years, I only made one. It wasn't an act of revenge. It was muscle memory breaking. The sound of the coffee dripping into the pot was the only sound in the room. I leaned against the counter and thought about everything that had just happened. Not with anger, not even sadness, just the kind of exhaustion that comes when you've been pretending for too long. And somewhere in that quiet morning, between the smell of coffee and the ticking clock, I knew. This was the beginning of the end, and I wasn't afraid anymore. I didn't tell him I was leaving. Not because I wanted to hurt him, but because I didn't see the point in announcing it. You don't make speeches to someone who's already stopped listening. It started on a Sunday morning, gray and cold, the kind of day that already feels like an ending. Thomas was still asleep upstairs, snoring softly like a man with no worries in the world. I sat in the kitchen, staring at my coffee, and realized I couldn't do another breakfast pretending we were fine. I went upstairs quietly and opened my closet. It's funny how easy it is to pack a life once you stop caring about the memories. I took only what I needed. Clothes, a few photos of the kids, my journal, and the ring he'd given me, which I slipped into an envelope instead of my suitcase. Every sound in the house felt louder than usual, the zipper of the bag, the creak of the floor, the faint sound of him breathing in the next room. I half expected him to wake up and ask where I was going. He didn't. Before leaving, I sat on the edge of the bed. He was still turned away from me, the same way he always slept now. I watched him for a moment. The man I'd loved for 15 years. The man who'd told me he regretted marrying me. He looked peaceful, content, maybe even free. I whispered, "You got what you wanted," though I knew he'd never hear it. Downstairs, I placed my journal and a printed copy of those emails on the kitchen table. On top, I left a note written on plain white paper. You said you regret marrying me. Now you'll know what regret really means. No signature. He didn't deserve one. I stood there for a few seconds, looking at the quiet kitchen, the clock ticking, the faint hum of the refrigerator, sunlight creeping across the floor. It all felt painfully ordinary for a moment that was anything but. Then I walked out. No tears. No second thoughts. Just the sound of the door clicking shut behind me. Outside, the air was cold enough to sting. I loaded my bag into the car and sat there for a minute, hands on the steering wheel, waiting for the rush of fear or guilt that never came. I felt nothing, just light, like the silence after a storm. I drove without a destination at first. The roads looked different somehow, like I was seeing them for the first time. Familiar stores, gas stations, houses, all of it blurred past like someone else's life. I didn't cry. I didn't even think. I just drove until the city disappeared behind me. At one point, I stopped at a small diner off the highway. The waitress smiled and asked, "Traveling somewhere?" "Yeah," I said. "Something like that." End problem. She poured me coffee, and for a strange second, I wanted to tell her everything. The emails, the laughter, the quiet death of a marriage, but I didn't. Instead, I just watched the steam rise from the cup and realized how peaceful it felt to sit alone without tiptoeing around someone else's moods. When I checked my phone, there were no missed calls. Not one. It's incredible how fast you become invisible once you stop being useful to someone. I drove another few hours until I reached my best friend Janet's house. We'd known each other since college. She was the kind of person who never asked questions until you were ready to talk. She opened the door and just stared at me for a second before saying, "You look like someone who finally exhaled." I laughed, though it came out shaky. "Something like that." She didn't press. She just took my bag and said, "Guest room's ready. Coffee or wine?" "Wine," I said. That night, I lay in her guest bed, wide awake. The house was warm. The sheets smelled clean, but my mind wouldn't stop replaying the image of that kitchen table, the journal, the emails, the note. I wondered how long it would take him to find them, if he'd read the note twice, trying to understand what it meant, if he'd even care. But mostly, I wondered why I cared at all. Around midnight, I got up and stood by the window. The moonlight hit the glass just enough to show my reflection. I looked tired, yes, but something in my face had changed. There was no anger left, just clarity. People always talk about revenge like it's fire, but mine didn't burn. It froze everything until it was clean and still. In that silence, I realized something I hadn't in years. I didn't need him to understand what he'd done. I just needed to be free of it. Back in our house, he was probably still asleep, unaware that his perfect morning routine would never happen again. I pictured him walking downstairs, making coffee, maybe calling out my name without expecting an answer. Maybe he'd see the empty closet first. Maybe he'd notice the missing ring. Or maybe it would take the note for it to hit him. It didn't matter. I wouldn't be there to see it. I crawled back into bed and pulled the blanket up to my chin. For the first time in years, I felt warm for reasons that had nothing to do with anyone else. I thought of all the times I'd begged silently for him to notice me, to care, to remember who I was before the distance. And now, I didn't need him to. Somewhere between exhaustion and relief, I fell asleep with a strange thought in my mind that maybe leaving isn't an act of revenge at all. Maybe it's just an overdue correction. By morning, I woke to the sound of birds and sunlight spilling through the curtains. I didn't feel lost. I didn't even feel sad. Just lighter, as if I'd finally set something down I was never meant to carry. Janet knocked softly and asked if I wanted breakfast. I smiled. "Yeah," I said. "I think I do." And as I walked into her kitchen, the air smelled like coffee and toasted bread. Not guilt, not regret, just peace. Thomas didn't call me that day. Or the next. I knew he wouldn't. He'd never been the type to chase after anyone, not even the woman who spent 15 years cleaning up his messes and pretending silence was love. By the third morning, he finally noticed I wasn't coming back. Janet called to check on me, said she'd heard from one of our mutual friends that Thomas had shown up at work, looking off. That was their polite way of saying he looked like hell. I didn't ask for details. I didn't need to imagine it. I knew exactly what that house felt like now. The quiet, the echo, the untouched coffee mug. That house had been my prison, but it was also his mirror now. And for the first time, he'd have to sit with the reflection. He probably walked into the kitchen that morning, expecting to see me standing by the counter, hair messy, half smiling the way I always did when I was trying to make peace after another argument. Instead, all he found was my journal, and that note. Knowing Thomas, he read it more than once. He probably scoffed the first time, dramatic as always. Then, when the silence stretched too long and the realization settled in, he likely sat down. Because that's what men like him do when they finally meet consequences they can't control. They sit, and they stare, and they pretend they don't care. I could picture him opening the journal, flipping through the pages I'd filled over the years. He'd see the lists, first groceries, birthdays, reminders to pay bills, and assume that's all there was. But eventually, he'd hit the real part. The pain I'd kept quiet, the nights I'd written about feeling invisible, the dinner where he joked about tolerating me, the day he forgot our anniversary, the moment he told me he regretted marrying me. He'd see it all, in my handwriting, without filter or softness. And for once, he'd have to hear my side of the story, not through shouting, not through tears, but through the calm of ink on paper. I don't know if he cried. Thomas wasn't a man who cried easily, not even when his father died. But maybe, when he reached the last page and saw my final words, "Now you'll know what regret really means," something inside him cracked. Because that's the thing about men like him. They don't believe you'll ever really leave until you're already gone. While he sat in that hollow house, I was sitting at Janet's kitchen table, hands wrapped around a cup of tea, watching the morning light move across the walls. Everything felt quiet, but in a different way. Not suffocating quiet, peaceful quiet. Janet asked if I wanted to talk about it. I shook my head. "There's nothing left to say." She nodded. "Then just breathe." And I did. For the next few days, I existed like a ghost, relearning how to live. I walked around the block, did small errands, even watched TV without checking the clock every 10 minutes. It was strange, the way ordinary things suddenly felt new again. Meanwhile, back in that house, I imagined Thomas wandering through the rooms like a man trying to find his shadow. The empty space beside the bed. The kitchen drawer without my favorite mug. The closet missing my clothes. He'd never admit it out loud, but that's when regret began to settle in. Not the dramatic kind, the slow, creeping kind that shows up when you realize no one's waiting for you anymore. He'd probably start small heating leftovers instead of ordering takeout, telling himself he liked the quiet. Then the quiet would stretch too long, and the silence would stop feeling like peace. It would start to sound like punishment. I didn't want him to suffer. Not really. I just wanted him to feel something. Anything. One afternoon, Janet found me sitting on her porch, staring at nothing. "You okay?" she asked. "Yeah," I said. "I just keep thinking about how empty that house must feel." She sipped her coffee. "You mean the one you left?" "Yeah." "Then maybe it was never really a home to begin with." That line stuck with me. Because she was right. It had walls, furniture, pictures, but it wasn't a home. It was a performance stage for a marriage that had died years ago. That night, while Thomas was probably eating dinner alone at that same kitchen table, I wrote him one last line in a new journal. "You wanted freedom. You have it. I hope you like the sound of it when it echoes back at you." I didn't send it. I didn't need to. The message was already written in the silence between us. By the end of the week, Janet suggested we go to the farmer's market. "You need some fresh air," she said. The sun was warm, the kind that seeps into your skin and makes you feel human again. I walked past flower stands and fruit stalls, smelling peaches and mint, and realized how long it had been since I'd noticed something simple. When I got back to Janet's house, there was a text on my phone from an unknown number. I didn't need to check who it was. It said, "So this is it?" I typed back, "It's been it for a long time, Thomas." Then I blocked the number. No more half-hearted words. No more guilt. That night, I sat by the window again. The moonlight spilled across the floor, and I thought about how strange it was to feel both lonely and free at the same time. But loneliness, I realized, wasn't always a bad thing. Sometimes it's the sound of peace arriving after years of noise. I didn't hate Thomas. I didn't wish him misery. But I knew this much: for the first time in 15 years, He was living in the same silence he had once given me. And maybe, just maybe, that was what regret really sounded like. The mornings at Janet's house felt different. The quiet didn't scare me anymore. It had a kind of softness to it, like the world was finally giving me permission to rest. I'd wake up to the smell of coffee brewing and sunlight sliding across the walls, and for a few seconds, I'd forget that my life had fallen apart. Janet never treated me like I was broken. She didn't hover or ask if I was okay every hour. She just let me exist. Some days, that meant sitting on her porch in sweatpants with a blanket over my shoulders, watching the mailman make his rounds. Other days, it meant cooking breakfast together and pretending we were two teenagers with nowhere to be. It was strange, though, how empty I felt once the shock wore off. I didn't miss Thomas exactly. I missed the version of myself that used to believe in us. The woman who thought love could be fixed if she just tried harder. That woman was gone, and I didn't know what to do with the silence she left behind. One afternoon, Janet came home from work and found me scrubbing her kitchen counters like I was trying to erase a stain that wasn't there. She leaned on the doorway, arms crossed, a knowing smile on her face. "You know, cleaning is not an Olympic sport," she said. "It's something to do," I replied. "Clara, it's okay to stop doing for a while. You don't have to earn your space here." "Oh." Her voice was kind, but it landed like a challenge. I realized she was right. For years, I'd been moving, cooking, cleaning, managing just to prove I was worth keeping around. Standing still felt unnatural. That night, after she went to bed, I sat alone in the living room with a glass of wine. The silence was heavy, but not hostile. I stared at my reflection in the dark window and whispered, "What now?" The woman who looked back at me didn't have an answer. The next morning, I decided to take a walk. Nothing dramatic, just down the block, past the bakery and the old post office. The air was crisp, the kind that wakes you up without asking permission. I walked without thinking, just putting one foot in front of the other, until I reached a small park I didn't know existed. Kids were playing on the swings, dogs chasing frisbees, people laughing over coffee. I sat on a bench and watched them. It wasn't envy I felt, not exactly. It was curiosity. What did it feel like to be that open again, to laugh without pretending? I stayed there until the sun started dipping low, and then I walked home with sore feet and a strange calm in my chest. When I got back, Janet was cooking pasta. "You disappeared," she said lightly. "I took a walk," I replied. "I think it helped." She smiled. "Good. Tomorrow we're going grocery shopping. And you're picking the wine." End of quote. It was such a small thing, but it felt like a plan, a tiny seed of something normal. Over the next few days, I started reclaiming small pieces of myself. I cooked again, not because anyone expected it, but because I wanted the kitchen to smell like garlic and rosemary. I played music while washing dishes. I even laughed, really laughed, when Janet accidentally dropped an entire jar of marinara sauce on the floor and muttered, "Well, dinner's abstract art now." Amen. The heaviness in my chest didn't vanish overnight, but it started to loosen its grip. Then one night, I found myself opening a new notebook. Not the old journal I'd left, that one behind, like a tombstone for who I used to be. This one was blank, clean, waiting. The first thing I wrote was simple. "I don't know who I am without being someone's wife, but I want to find out." I closed it, placed it beside the bed, and turned off the light. That sentence became my quiet promise. A few mornings later, while Janet was at work, I found an old note folded inside my purse, something I must have slipped in months ago. It was a grocery list on one side, but on the back, in my handwriting, I'd written, "Remember to be grateful." I stared at it for a long time. Grateful? For what? And then it hit me, for finally being honest. For finally leaving. For the strength to stop trying to resurrect something dead. That afternoon, I baked a small loaf of bread. The house filled with that comforting, yeasty smell, and I couldn't help smiling. When Janet came home, she sniffed the air and grinned. "Look at you," she said. "You're turning into the neighborhood baker already." "Don't tempt me," I joked. "I might start charging." She laughed, but there was a warmth in her eyes I hadn't seen before. "You're starting to look like yourself again." Later that night, as I sat by the window with a cup of tea, I thought about those words. Yourself again. But the truth was, I wasn't going back to who I'd been. I was building someone new from what was left. The woman who used to beg for attention was gone. The one sitting here now didn't need it. She just needed real, deep breaths that didn't hurt. For the first time in a long while, I slept soundly. No restless tossing, no cold space beside me. Just the soft rhythm of my own breathing in a room that finally felt like mine. When morning came, I stood on the porch, coffee in hand, watching the world move around me. I didn't feel like a woman who'd been left. I felt like a woman who'd finally walked herself home. It was almost 3 weeks before Thomas reached out. By then, I'd stopped checking my phone the way I used to. I wasn't waiting for an apology. I wasn't waiting for anything. Most days, I woke up early, helped Janet water the plants, and spent my afternoons writing or walking through the park. It wasn't excitement that filled my days, but peace, quiet, steady, earned peace. The message came on a Wednesday morning, just a single line, "We need to talk." For a moment, I stared at it. The old me would have responded immediately, demanding answers, explanations, closure. But that woman was gone. So I put my phone face down on the table and went back to kneading bread dough. A few hours later, another message came. I read everything, the journal, the emails. I didn't realize how bad it was. I almost laughed. Didn't realize. That's what people say when they've had years to notice but chose not to. I didn't reply. That night, Janet noticed I was quiet during dinner. He reached out, didn't he? I nodded. She raised an eyebrow. You going to answer? No, I said. I don't need to hear his reasons. Janet smiled faintly. Good. Let him sit in it for a while. But silence wasn't what Thomas was used to. 2 days later, he called. I didn't pick up. Then he texted again. I didn't mean what I said that night. I was angry. Lost. Please, can we talk? I didn't believe him. Men like Thomas don't get lost, they just run out of people to blame. Later that evening, I scrolled through my phone photos. Old trips, holidays, birthdays, every image looked like a lie now. The smiles, the dinners, the moments frozen in fake happiness. And yet, buried in all that pretending, there were small flashes of truth. Me, standing a little too far from him. Him, never quite looking at me. The distance, visible even in stillness. I turned the phone off and sat by the window. Outside, the streetlights glowed against the dark, steady and quiet. That's when I realized I didn't hate him. I didn't even want revenge anymore. What I wanted was indifference, the freedom to not care. The next morning, Janet left early for work, and I found myself alone in the house. I made coffee, sat at the kitchen table, and thought about how strange it felt to be at peace while someone else's world was falling apart. Around noon, a delivery driver dropped off an envelope. My name was on it in Thomas's handwriting. No return address, just that familiar, neat print I used to find comforting. I set it aside for an hour before opening it. Inside was a letter, folded twice, the paper creased like he'd read it over and over before sending it. Glada, I don't expect forgiveness. I just need you to know I finally understand. I read every word you wrote, every page, every thought. I saw myself in those sentences, the man who stopped listening, who stopped caring. I thought comfort was love. I thought silence was peace. I was wrong. The house feels empty now, like I'm walking through the shell of something I ruined with my own hands. I keep waiting to hear you humming in the kitchen or see your shoes by the door. It's like you're still here, but only in the places that hurt the most. I know I said things that can't be undone. I regret them more than I can say. I regret everything. If you never want to see me again, I understand. But I needed you to know. I see you now. And I'm sorry. I know. By the time I finished reading, my hands were trembling slightly. Not from sadness, from recognition. It was the first time he'd ever said sorry without making it sound like a negotiation. I folded the letter back up, placed it on the counter, and stood there for a long time. Then I took it outside, lit a match, and watched it burn in the small fire pit behind Janet's house. The paper curled, blackened, and vanished into ash. It didn't feel dramatic, It felt right. Like setting down a weight I'd been carrying too long. That night, I wrote in my new journal. He regrets it, but I don't. Because regret means wishing you could go back. I'm not going back. 2 days later, Janet and I drove out to the lake for the weekend. The air smelled like pine and rain. I stood by the water, watching the ripples shift under the breeze, and thought about how regret is just another kind of prison. People like Thomas stay locked in it because they think saying sorry erases the past. It doesn't. It just acknowledges it. Janet tossed me a pebble. Your turn, she said. I skipped it across the surface 1, 2, 3 skips before it sank. Not bad, she said. I smiled. It's a start. When we got back that night, my phone buzzed again. I almost ignored it, but something made me check. It was another message from Thomas. Just 2 words this time. I understand. I typed a reply, paused, then deleted it. There was nothing left to say. I placed the phone on the nightstand, turned off the light, and lay back in bed. The house was quiet, except for the hum of the refrigerator and the soft rustle of wind outside. And in that stillness, I realized something important. Regret wasn't my burden to carry anymore. It was his. Mine was peace, and I was finally learning how to live with it. I thought the letter would be the end of it. I thought Thomas would take his regret and finally fade into the background of my life. But people like him don't know how to sit quietly with guilt. They keep trying to rewrite the ending after it's already been printed. A week after the first letter, another envelope came. No return address again, but the same neat handwriting. I almost threw it away. Curiosity won. Inside was a single page. Clara, I've made mistakes that I can't fix. I just want to see you one last time, not to beg, not to argue, just to say I'm sorry in person. Please meet me at the park near our old house. Sunday, noon. If you don't come, I'll understand. I placed the letter on the counter and stared at it for a long time. My hands didn't shake this time. I wasn't angry, just tired. Janet found me still standing there when she got home. He's still writing? She asked, glancing at the paper. Yeah, he wants to meet. And? You're not actually thinking about going, are you? I hesitated. I don't know. Maybe I need to look him in the eye one last time. Not for him, but for me. She sighed. If you go, don't go to forgive him. Go to finish it. That line stuck. Sunday came faster than I expected. The morning was cool, the kind that smelled faintly of wet grass and beginnings. I drove to the park, parking in the same lot where we used to bring the kids when they were small. Everything looked familiar, but distant, like I was visiting a scene from someone else's memory. Thomas was already there, sitting on a bench. He looked older. Not in the way people age naturally, but in the way regret wears down your face. When he saw me, he stood up awkwardly, hands in his pockets. You came, he said. I did. We stood there in silence for a moment. The breeze rustled the trees, and somewhere nearby, a dog barked. He gestured to the bench. Can we sit? I nodded. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. Then he said softly, You look different. I am, I said. He nodded, like that answer made more sense than it should have. I've been thinking about everything, about what I said, what I did. Thinking doesn't undo it. I know, he said quickly. I wanted you to know that I see it now, all the ways I failed you. I thought you were just distant. I didn't realize you were disappearing. I looked at him. You didn't want to realize it. You were comfortable with me fading out of your life as long as I still made dinner and laughed at your jokes. His eyes flickered with shame. You're right. I waited, but he didn't try to defend himself this time. That was new. After a moment, he said quietly, The house feels empty without you. Of course it does. You built it to depend on my silence. He looked down at his hands. I wish I could take it all back. You can't. And even if you could, I wouldn't go with you. That seemed to hit him harder than anything else. So that's it? 15 years? And it just ends like this? It ended a long time ago, I said. You just didn't notice until I was gone. He nodded slowly, eyes glassy. I read the part in your journal where you wrote that love shouldn't feel like endurance. That line stuck with me. You were right. You deserved better than what I gave you. For a long moment we sat there without speaking. The air between us was heavy but calm, like a storm had passed and left only silence behind. Finally, I stood. I have to go. He looked up. Will you ever forgive me? I already have, I said. That's how I was able to leave. He blinked, confused. Then why does it still hurt? Because forgiveness isn't for you. It's for me. I walked away before he could say another word. When I got back to Janet's house, I felt lighter, not because anything had changed, but because I finally saw him for what he was, a man trapped in the consequences of his own choices. That evening, I sat on the porch with a cup of tea. The sky turned gold, then purple, and I realized I hadn't thought about him for hours. Janet joined me, sitting on the step. How was it? She asked. Final, I said. She smiled. Good. Then maybe now you can start something new. Bye? Later that night, I pulled out my notebook and wrote, I don't hate him. I don't love him. I just don't belong to that story anymore. I stared at those words for a while. They didn't sting, they didn't ache, they just felt true. Over the next few days, Thomas sent one last message. Thank you for coming. I'll leave you alone now. And he did. For once, his silence didn't feel like punishment. It felt like freedom. I spent that week painting the guest room with Janet pale yellow, warm and soft. She said it would brighten the house. I told her it already felt brighter. When we finished, we stood in the doorway, admiring our work. Looks good, she said. It does, I agreed. And it's staying that way. The smell of fresh paint filled the air clean, sharp, alive. I breathed it in slowly and smiled. Some people spend their whole lives waiting for closure. But sometimes closure isn't a conversation or an apology. Sometimes it's just the sound of your own breath after years of holding it in. And that's exactly what it felt like that night, like I was finally breathing for myself again. And if you've ever been through something like this, if you've lived through a cheating husband or carried years of silence pretending it was love, I want you to remember, peace is the most powerful form of revenge there is. If you enjoyed this story, and want more family revenge stories, more true cheating and quiet strength, make sure revenge stories like this one stories of heartbreak, courage, and the kind of healing that leaves no room for hate, only peace.